When billionaire Ethan Miller secretly returned home early one evening, he expected a quiet dinner with his mother and his fiancée. But what he saw inside his mansion that night would shatter his heart and change his life forever. Ethan Miller was known across New York as the young, charming billionaire who seemed to have everything a man could ever want: a rapidly growing tech empire that had revolutionized online security, a mansion that stood tall over Manhattan's skyline, and a fiancée who was admired wherever she went. His life was the kind of story people read about in glossy magazines, filled with power, glamour, and luxury. Every photograph of him and Sophie Turner at charity events or grand galas told the same tale: a perfect couple living a dream. Sophie, with her flawless beauty, graceful manners, and polished charm, was adored by the media and envied by many women. She always smiled for the cameras, always said the right things, and always looked like she belonged in Ethan's world of wealth and sophistication. To the public, she was everything a man like Ethan could ask for: elegant, intelligent, and kind. But what no one knew was that beneath Sophie's charm and poise lay a personality as cold and manipulative as ice. Behind her polite words and sweet laughter hid a hunger for control, a desire not for love, but for power, luxury, and the status that came with being the wife of a billionaire. Her smiles were rehearsed, her gestures calculated, and every word she spoke in public was designed to build her image, not her character. In that towering mansion of marble floors and glass walls lived one person who saw through the glitter: Ethan's mother, Margaret Miller. A widow in her 60s, Margaret was nothing like the people in her son's world. She had spent most of her life in a small town before moving in with Ethan after her husband's death. She was gentle and warm-hearted, the kind of woman who still believed in handwritten letters and homemade meals. Despite the luxury around her, she lived simply. Preferring a cup of tea, she brewed herself over the expensive coffee served by the staff. Her joy came from small things: tending to her flowers on the balcony, reading old novels, and spending quiet evenings talking to her son about life. Margaret adored Ethan deeply. To her, he was still the little boy who once built toy robots in the garage and dreamed of changing the world. And while she was proud of the man he had become, she worried that success had surrounded him with people who loved his wealth more than his heart. She wanted to believe Sophie was different, that maybe she truly cared for Ethan, but something about her always felt too perfect, too polished, too rehearsed. There were moments when Margaret caught Sophie's eyes filled with irritation instead of kindness, especially when the cameras weren't around. Among the mansion's many employees, one stood out to Margaret: Grace. Grace was a young black maid in her late 20s who had joined the Miller household only a year earlier. She came from a modest background, raised by a single mother who taught her the value of honesty, respect, and hard work. Grace didn't speak much. She preferred to let her actions show her dedication. Every corner she cleaned sparkled. Every tray she carried was perfectly arranged, and she always greeted everyone with a quiet, genuine smile. There was something about her presence that brought warmth to the otherwise cold, glittering house. Margaret quickly grew fond of her. Grace would often accompany her during her evening walks in the garden, carrying a small blanket or helping her with the flowers. They would talk about simple things, childhood memories, the changing seasons, or favorite recipes. Grace listened with genuine interest, and Margaret appreciated that. She once told Ethan, "That girl, Grace, reminds me of your grandmother. Humble, patient, and full of heart." Ethan had smiled, barely paying attention, too busy with his endless meetings and company matters. Grace, in return, admired Margaret's kindness. Unlike many wealthy employers she had worked for, Margaret treated her with respect, not as a servant, but as a person. Sometimes, when Margaret sat alone on the balcony, Grace would bring her tea without being asked. "You shouldn't always serve me, Grace," Margaret would say with a gentle laugh. But Grace would smile and reply, "It's not service, ma'am. It's care." That bond between them didn't go unnoticed. Sophie, who prided herself on being the center of attention in the mansion, began to feel an unfamiliar irritation growing inside her. At first, she brushed it off. After all, why should she care about a maid and an old woman? But over time, the way Margaret's face lit up when Grace entered the room, or how Ethan's mother praised Grace's manners during dinner, started to gnaw at her pride. Sophie had always been used to admiration. She couldn't stand being overshadowed by someone she considered beneath her. She started to make small remarks. "Mother Margaret seems to talk about Grace a lot," she once said to Ethan, pretending to joke. "Maybe I should start learning her cleaning tricks." Ethan had laughed lightly, not realizing the bitterness behind her words. But Sophie wasn't joking. Her jealousy deepened when she realized Margaret had influence over Ethan's personal decisions. Ethan respected his mother's opinion more than anyone else's. Whenever they discussed their wedding plans, Ethan would say, "Let me check with Mom first." To Sophie, that was intolerable. She wanted full control over the event, over Ethan's image, and eventually over his fortune. But Margaret's quiet presence stood in her way. The more Sophie tried to charm Margaret, the more distant the older woman became. Margaret could sense the insincerity in Sophie's compliments, the faint impatience in her voice, the way her smile disappeared the second she turned away. One evening, Margaret gently told Ethan, "She's beautiful, son, but I hope you're marrying her heart, not her face." Ethan had simply hugged her and said, "Don't worry, Mom. Sophie's good to me." But even as he said it, part of him wondered if his mother's instincts were right. Meanwhile, Grace noticed the tension growing between Sophie and Margaret. She often found Sophie glaring at Margaret or criticizing her under her breath. But Grace stayed quiet, focusing on her work. Still, she made it her mission to be there for Margaret, ensuring she never felt alone. What none of them knew was that Sophie's resentment was slowly turning into cruelty. Her envy of Grace's bond with Margaret and her frustration over not having full control over Ethan were feeding something darker inside her. And in the silence of that magnificent mansion, where chandeliers sparkled above and secrets festered below, a storm was quietly brewing, one that would soon expose who truly belonged in that house and who never did. It started small, so small that at first, no one could have guessed the darkness quietly blooming inside the house. Sophie would roll her eyes whenever Margaret spoke, her lips curling into a faint smirk that only Grace sometimes noticed. She'd interrupt Margaret mid-sentence with a laugh or a sigh, making the older woman feel small and outdated. "Oh, Margaret," Sophie would say in that falsely sweet tone, "you really must keep up with the world. Nobody does things that way anymore." Margaret always tried to respond with kindness, though each remark left a subtle wound on her gentle heart. She didn't want to cause conflict or make her son uncomfortable, so she smiled, changed the subject, and convinced herself Sophie was just stressed. But Grace, who often stood silently in the background, cleaning or arranging flowers, saw through all. She noticed the tension in Margaret's voice and the way her hands trembled slightly after each exchange. When Ethan wasn't around, Sophie's mask slipped completely. Without the cameras or her fiancé watching, she dropped her charm and replaced it with sharp, bitter cruelty. The mansion that once echoed with laughter and the soft hum of music turned into a quiet battlefield of unspoken pain. One calm afternoon, while Ethan was away on a week-long business trip to London, Margaret decided to do something thoughtful. She'd baked a small tray of cookies, something she hadn't done in years. They weren't perfect, but they were made with the same love she used to bake with for her late husband and young Ethan. The smell of butter and sugar filled the air, soft and comforting, like a piece of the past brought to life again. Margaret carried the tray into the living room, where Sophie sat elegantly on the couch, scrolling through her phone with her legs crossed and her sunglasses still perched on her head. She barely noticed the older woman entering. "I thought you might like a snack, dear," Margaret said, her voice warm and kind, a smile gently tugging at her lips. Sophie didn't even look up. "What is it?" "Just some cookies. They're fresh out of the oven," Margaret replied hopefully. Sophie glanced at the tray for half a second and scoffed. "Do you think I eat this?" "I'm not one of your poor tea guests, Margaret. Just leave it on the table." The words hit Margaret like a slap. Her smile faltered, and for a brief moment, she stood frozen, unsure how to respond. Grace, who had been dusting a nearby bookshelf, stopped mid-motion, her heart tightening. She wanted to say something, to defend the woman who had shown her nothing but love, but fear held her back. Speaking up against Sophie could mean losing her job, and jobs like this were hard to come by. Margaret quietly placed the tray down and turned away. "Of course, dear," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Grace caught the faint shimmer of tears in her eyes before Margaret disappeared down the hall. The moment the older woman left, Sophie rolled her eyes dramatically and muttered, "Pathetic," before going back to her phone. Grace pretended to return to her work, but inside, her anger simmered. How could someone be so heartless to a woman who only wanted to show love? From that day, Grace began noticing more cruelty from Sophie. It started with small, cutting remarks about Margaret's habits or clothing. Sophie mocked her for watching old movies, for wearing outdated sweaters, even for keeping framed family photos in the hallway. "This house should look like a billionaire's home, not a retirement cottage," Sophie once snapped, grabbing one of the frames and tossing it onto a shelf carelessly. Margaret said nothing. She always believed silence was stronger than anger. But silence, in this case, only fueled Sophie's arrogance. When Ethan called to check in from London, Sophie's tone transformed instantly. "Your mother's been wonderful," she said sweetly. "We've been spending lots of time together." Margaret smiled faintly in the background, never realizing how twisted the lie was. Grace, however, saw the truth. She began to notice the way Sophie's cruelty escalated with every passing day. One afternoon, Sophie scolded Margaret for touching the decorative vase in the hallway. "That's not yours to clean," she snapped. "You're always meddling. You don't need to prove you're useful. Just stay out of my way." Grace's grip on her duster tightened, her chest burning with anger. Still, she said nothing. Then came the worst day yet. Margaret couldn't find her medication. She searched the drawers, the cabinets, even her purse, but the pills were gone. Sophie watched from the doorway with a smug little smile. "Maybe you misplaced them," she said casually, sipping her iced coffee. "People your age tend to forget things." Margaret didn't suspect anything malicious. She simply nodded, embarrassed, and went to her room, her breathing slightly heavy. But Grace saw Sophie open her handbag later that evening, and inside was the missing bottle of pills. She had hidden them. Grace's heart pounded in shock, but fear froze her again. She wanted to confront Sophie, but who would believe her? She was just a maid. The cruelty reached a breaking point a few nights later. Margaret was walking through the hallway, trying to take a phone call from Ethan. Sophie, who had been pacing impatiently, brushed past her and snapped. "Can't you move faster? You're blocking the Wi-Fi signal." When Margaret tried to step aside, Sophie shoved her shoulder. It wasn't a hard push, but it was filled with disrespect, an act meant to humiliate, not harm. "Stay out of my way, old woman," Sophie hissed before storming off. The phone slipped from Margaret's trembling hands. She didn't tell Ethan what had happened. She couldn't bear to worry him while he was away. Instead, she simply went to her room and cried quietly, not wanting anyone to hear. But someone did hear. Grace stood outside the door, her heart breaking. She had seen enough. That night, Grace made a decision that changed everything. She took out her phone and began secretly recording Sophie's behavior whenever Ethan wasn't around. At first, it was just short clips, a cruel remark here, a mocking laugh there. But as the days went on, the recordings grew darker. Sophie yelling at Margaret for sitting on her couch. Sophie rolling her eyes and saying, "No wonder your husband died early. He couldn't stand your nagging." Sophie tossing a cup of tea Margaret had prepared onto the floor, saying it was too bitter, even though it wasn't. Each video became a piece of evidence, a truth the world needed to see. Grace didn't know what she would do with them yet. She only knew that someone had to know, and if no one else would protect Margaret, she would. Still, the guilt haunted her. Every night, she lay awake in her small room, wondering if she should speak up. What if she lost her job? What if Sophie found out? But then she remembered the way Margaret smiled through her tears and said, "You're more family than most people I know." Grace decided she couldn't stay silent anymore. In a mansion filled with secrets and luxury, one maid had finally found the courage to stand up for kindness and to expose the cruelty hiding behind a diamond ring. One Friday evening, the sun was setting behind the Manhattan skyline, painting the city in golden and rose-colored hues. Inside the Miller mansion, everything was quiet except for the faint ticking of the antique clock in the hallway. The staff had gone home early, leaving only Grace, Margaret, and Sophie in the house. Ethan had told everyone that he would be returning from his business conference late that night, close to midnight. He had a reputation for being punctual and predictable, and Sophie had already planned the evening for herself. A glass of expensive wine, a long bath, and perhaps a few smug thoughts about how her life was perfectly under control. She didn't know that her perfect control was about to shatter forever. Ethan's conference had ended earlier than expected. The final meeting wrapped up just before sunset, and instead of staying at the hotel as planned, he decided to catch an early flight home. "It'll be a surprise for Mom," he said to his assistant with a smile. She loves surprises. By the time his car pulled up outside the mansion, the sky had darkened, and soft rain had begun to fall. Ethan stepped out, holding a bouquet of lilies, his mother's favorite. He walked quietly toward the front door, not wanting to alert anyone. He wanted to see the look of joy on his mother's face when she saw him standing there, unannounced. But when he opened the door, something immediately felt wrong. The usual warmth of home, the soft music, the smell of tea, the comforting chatter, was gone. Instead, a sharp voice echoed through the hallway. He froze. The voice came from the living room. It was Sophie's. At first, he smiled, thinking she might be on a phone call. But as he moved closer, her tone grew harsh, venomous. His heart began to pound. Slowly, he peered through the half-open door. And that's when he saw it. Sophie stood towering over his mother, her perfect face twisted with fury. Her eyes blazed with hatred, her voice trembling with rage. "You old witch," she screamed. "You're ruining everything. Why can't you just stay in your room and mind your own business?" Margaret, frail but dignified, tried to steady herself. "Sophie, please. I don't understand why you're speaking this way," she said softly, her voice shaking. Sophie didn't care. "Oh, don't pretend to be innocent," she spat. "You've been poisoning Ethan against me from the start. You think you could decide who he should marry? You pathetic, jealous woman." Before Margaret could say another word, Sophie shoved her. It wasn't a small push. It was hard enough that Margaret stumbled backward, her hand catching the edge of the table as her body swayed dangerously. Grace, who had been in the next room polishing silverware, heard the commotion and rushed in just in time. "Ma'am," she cried, darting forward and catching Margaret before she hit the floor. "That's enough, Miss Sophie," Grace shouted, her voice trembling but firm. "You can't talk to her like that." Sophie turned around, her eyes narrowing like a predator's. "You dare talk to me like that, you useless maid?" she hissed. "Get your filthy hands off her." Grace stood her ground, still holding Margaret upright. "No, not this time." Sophie's rage exploded. She raised her hand high, ready to strike Grace across the face. Her diamond ring glinted under the chandelier's light, a cruel sparkle that matched the fury in her eyes. But before her hand could land, another hand grabbed her wrist midair, firm, strong, and unyielding. Ethan's. The sound of his voice sliced through the room like thunder. "Sophie, what did you just do?" Sophie froze. Her body went rigid. Her confident mask, the one she wore so effortlessly in front of the world, shattered in an instant. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with panic, her lips trembling. "Ethan," she stammered, forcing a shaky smile. "You're home early. This isn't what it looks like. Your mother, she was being difficult. She said awful things to me. I was just—" "Stop," Ethan interrupted, his voice low but burning with fury. "I saw everything." The lilies fell from his hand onto the marble floor, petals scattering like silent witnesses. His jaw clenched as he took a slow step forward. The man who was usually calm and composed looked almost unrecognizable, his face pale, his eyes cold and filled with disbelief. "You insulted my mother," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "You shoved her in her own home, and then you tried to hit Grace." Sophie's eyes darted wildly between them. "Ethan, she was lying. Your mother's been turning you against me. That maid is just—" "Enough!" Ethan's voice boomed, echoing through the mansion. "Don't you dare talk about them that way." Margaret, still shaken, tried to intervene. "Ethan, please don't." But Ethan shook his head. "No, Mom. I've heard enough lies." The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the faint patter of rain against the windows. Grace stood still, her arms gently supporting Margaret. Her heart raced, unsure what would happen next. Sophie's face changed again, this time from fear to desperation. She tried to reach for Ethan's hand, but he stepped back. "Ethan, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "You don't understand. She hates me because she knows you love me. She wants to ruin us." Ethan stared at her, his eyes glistening with hurt. "Love," he said quietly. "If this is how you treat the people I love, you don't know what love is." Sophie's composure broke completely. "You can't just throw me away. After everything I've done for you, after everything I've given up." "What have you given up?" Ethan snapped. "You've given up nothing. You've only taken my trust, my peace, my respect." He looked toward Grace, who stood silently, her head lowered. "And you tried to hurt the only person who's shown my mother real kindness." For the first time, Sophie had no words. Her lips trembled, her eyes filled with tears, not of remorse, but of fear and humiliation. She realized the image she'd built, the life she'd designed, was collapsing right before her. Ethan turned to Grace and Margaret, his voice softening slightly. "Are you both all right?" Grace nodded quietly. Margaret whispered, "Yes, dear. I'm fine." Sophie took a step closer, her voice trembling. "Ethan, please. Let's just talk privately. Don't do this in front of them." He shook his head slowly. "No, there's nothing left to talk about." Sophie's eyes filled with fury again, but she swallowed it down. Her gaze darted to Grace, full of venom. "You'll regret this," she whispered, her voice low and poisonous. Ethan's expression hardened. "No, Sophie. The only person who should regret anything here is you." He pulled his phone from his pocket and called his security. Come to the house immediately, he said flatly. An escort Miss Turner out. Sophie's face went pale. Ethan, you can't. I can. And I will. Within minutes, 2 guards entered the mansion. Sophie tried to resist, pleading, crying, even screaming that they were making a mistake. But Ethan didn't move. He just stood there, silent, watching as the woman he thought he loved was led out of his home, out of his life. When the doors finally closed, the mansion fell silent again. The rain outside had stopped, and the air felt heavy, thick with emotion. Ethan turned toward his mother and Grace. He walked over and gently knelt beside them. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have seen it sooner." Margaret placed a trembling hand on his cheek. "You saw it when you were meant to, my son," she said softly. "Sometimes the truth waits for the right moment to reveal itself." Grace stayed quiet, her eyes lowered, not wanting to intrude on the moment. But Ethan looked at her and said, "And you, Grace, thank you for being brave when I wasn't here to protect her." Grace shook her head. "I just did what anyone with a heart would do, sir." Ethan gave a small, tired smile. "Then I wish the world had more people with hearts like yours." That night, as the storm outside cleared, Ethan realized something important, that love isn't proven by beauty, status, or wealth. It's proven by how one treats others when no one is watching. And in that moment, the mansion, once filled with pretense, finally felt like a home again. Ethan's expression hardened like stone. The silence in the grand living room felt suffocating. You could almost hear everyone's heartbeat. Sophie stood trembling, her voice caught in her throat as she tried to speak. But Ethan's eyes, burning with betrayal, stopped her cold. He stepped closer. "Grace," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with pain. "Tell me everything. Don't hide a single word." Grace looked down, clutching her phone tightly. For a moment, she hesitated, afraid that telling the truth might cost her the job she desperately needed. But Margaret, frail yet strong in spirit, gently touched her hand and whispered, "It's all right, dear. Tell him. The truth deserves to be heard." Grace swallowed hard and nodded. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked her phone. "Sir, I didn't want to interfere, but I couldn't watch your mother being treated this way anymore." She opened her gallery and handed the phone to Ethan. "I recorded these over the last few weeks." Ethan's brows furrowed as he took the phone. The first video played. Sophie's voice filled the air, sharp and venomous. "You old woman, you act like you own this place. Maybe it's time you remembered who's really in charge here." The video showed Margaret standing quietly, trying to hold back tears, while Sophie smirked at her cruelty. Ethan's hand tightened around the phone. He swiped to the next clip, Sophie deliberately knocking over Margaret's teacup and laughing. "Oh no, you made a mess again, didn't you? Useless, just useless." The next video, Sophie yanking a medicine bottle from Margaret's trembling hand, mocking her weak eyesight. And another, Sophie pushing Margaret's shoulder so she stumbled backward, whispering, "Stay out of my way if you know what's good for you." Each clip felt like a knife twisting deeper into Ethan's chest. His eyes grew red. His jaw clenched until the veins in his neck stood out. He slowly lowered the phone, staring at Sophie, the woman he once thought he would marry. The woman he had defended to his mother countless times. The woman who smiled at him every morning, pretended to love him while tormenting the only person who ever truly did. "How long?" he finally whispered. His voice was trembling now, but not from fear, from rage held deep inside. "How long have you been doing this to her?" Sophie stepped forward, tears brimming in her eyes, trying to appear innocent. "Ethan, please, you don't understand. She didn't like me. She kept judging me, making me feel unwanted. I just lost my temper sometimes." "Lost your temper?" Ethan snapped, his voice echoing through the mansion. You shoved her, humiliated her, mocked her, and you call that losing your temper? Sophie's lips quivered. I love you, Ethan. I did all this because I was scared of losing you to her influence. She never liked me. Ethan cut her off sharply. You don't hurt someone's mother because you're insecure, Sophie. You do that because you're heartless. He looked at his mother, who stood quietly beside Grace, tears sliding down her wrinkled cheeks. Ethan walked over to her and gently took her hands. I'm so sorry, Mom. I should have seen this. I should have protected you. Margaret shook her head softly. No, my son. Don't blame yourself. Evil often wears a beautiful mask. People show their true hearts only when they think no one's watching. Those words struck Ethan deeply. He turned his gaze back towards Sophie, his eyes no longer filled with sadness, only resolve. You're done, Sophie, he said coldly. Pack your things. You're leaving this house tonight, and you'll never come near my family again. Sophie's facade cracked completely. Ethan, please, don't do this to me. You can't throw me out like some stranger. She tried to move closer, reaching for his arm, but Ethan stepped back, disgusted. Don't, he said sharply. You made your choice when you laid a hand on my mother. Grace moved closer protectively, standing near Margaret. Sophie turned her anger toward her instead. This is all your fault, you pathetic maid. You ruined everything. But before she could say another word, Ethan raised his hand slightly, signaling the security staff at the door. Escort her out. Now. The guard stepped forward. Sophie began to panic. Wait. Ethan, please. I can change. I'll apologize. Her desperate cries echoed through the mansion as the guards gently but firmly took her arms. She kicked and screamed, her tears streaking her makeup, but Ethan didn't look at her again. The sound of the door closing behind her was the final end to a dark chapter. Silence followed, deep, heavy silence. Ethan stood still for a long moment, trying to calm his breathing. Grace placed a comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder, and the older woman smiled faintly, whispering, "It's over now." But Ethan felt shattered. He walked to the window, staring at the city lights glowing outside. Everything looked the same, yet inside, he felt completely different. He had learned the most painful lesson of all, that love without respect is poison. He turned back toward Grace. Thank you, he said sincerely. You didn't just help my mother, you saved us both. Grace lowered her eyes humbly. I just did what was right, sir. I couldn't stand by and watch her suffer. Margaret smiled at her warmly. You did more than that, dear. You showed courage when others would have stayed silent. Ethan nodded. From now on, you're not just a maid in this house, Grace. You're part of this family. Grace gasped, shaking her head. Oh no, sir, I can't. But Margaret reached out and took her hand gently. Yes, you can. You've earned it, my child. Tears filled Grace's eyes. For the first time in years, she felt seen, truly valued. Not for what she did, but for who she was. That night, the mansion felt lighter, not because of the luxury it held, but because the truth had finally come out. Ethan sat with his mother and Grace at the dinner table, sharing a simple meal that Margaret had made herself. They talked, laughed, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan saw his mother smile, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. He realized then that wealth could build empires, but kindness was what built homes. As for Sophie, she disappeared from their lives completely. But her downfall became a lesson Ethan would never forget, that sometimes angels have humble hearts and devils wear diamond rings. And from that day on, Ethan promised one thing, to always protect the ones who truly loved him, not for his money, but for the man he was. The days following Sophie's departure were unusually quiet in the Miller mansion. The once constant sound of tension and sharp words was gone, replaced by peace, the kind that only truth could bring. But even as calm returned, Ethan's mind couldn't rest. He kept replaying that night. Grace's trembling voice, his mother's tears, and the way truth had shattered the illusion he once lived in. He often found himself standing by the window, looking at the skyline of New York, wondering how easily he had been fooled by appearances. It wasn't Sophie's cruelty that hurt the most, it was his blindness. One morning, as the sunlight spilled through the tall windows, Ethan made a decision. He wanted to face the person who had changed everything, not out of guilt but out of gratitude. He sent word for Grace to come see him. Grace, unaware of what awaited her, entered the grand living room with hesitant steps. She still couldn't believe she had stood up to Sophie that day and survived. "Sir," she said softly, standing near the doorway. "You wanted to see me?" Ethan turned from the window. His expression wasn't the usual confident look of a billionaire. It was warm, thoughtful. "Yes, Grace. Come in." She obeyed quietly, unsure of why her heart was beating faster than usual. He motioned for her to sit, but she remained standing. "Grace," he began, "I've met thousands of people in my life, investors, politicians, people who claim to have courage. But I've never seen anyone like you." Grace looked down. "I only did what anyone should have done." Ethan shook his head gently. "No, Grace. You did what most wouldn't. You protected my mother when everyone else stayed silent. You didn't just show bravery, you showed humanity." Grace's eyes softened. "Ma'am, Margaret reminds me of my grandmother," she said quietly. "I couldn't stand there and let someone treat her that way. I just did what my heart told me to." At that moment, Margaret entered the room, walking slowly with her cane, but smiling radiantly. "And your heart," she said kindly, "was stronger than all the cruelty in this house." Grace immediately stood and helped her sit down. "Ma'am, please don't say that. I didn't do anything special." Margaret chuckled softly. "My dear, you gave me back something priceless, respect. And you reminded my son what real love looks like." Ethan smiled at his mother, then turned to Grace. "You've taught me more in a few weeks than most people have in years." He paused, taking a deep breath. "And I don't want what you did to go unnoticed. You changed 2 lives, Grace, mine and my mother's. I want to make sure your courage changes many more." Grace blinked in confusion. "I don't understand, sir." Ethan gestured toward a folder on the table. Inside was a document with gold lettering that read, "The Grace Initiative." "It's a charitable foundation," he explained, "dedicated to helping domestic workers, caregivers, and others who face abuse or injustice. Too many suffer in silence because they fear losing their livelihoods. You gave them a voice, and now I want that voice to reach the world." Grace was speechless. Her fingers trembled as she touched the folder. "Sir, you named it after me?" Ethan nodded with a soft smile. "It's not just a name, Grace. It's a message. That true strength doesn't come from wealth or power. It comes from compassion." Margaret reached over and gently squeezed Grace's hand. "You will lead this, my dear. You were born for it." Grace's eyes welled with tears. "Lead? Me? I don't know anything about running a foundation." Ethan smiled. "Neither did I when I started my company. But I believed in what I was doing. That's all that matters." There was a long pause. Then Grace whispered, "If this can help others like me, then I'll do it. I'll make you both proud." Margaret smiled. "You already have." Months later, the Grace Initiative officially launched with a small but heartfelt ceremony. The ballroom was filled with domestic workers, caretakers, and ordinary people whose silent struggles were finally being heard. Grace stood on stage in a simple dress, nervous but determined. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, but when she spoke, every sound in the room faded. "I was once just a maid," she said, her voice calm but powerful. "But in a world where silence protects cruelty, speaking up becomes an act of courage. No one deserves to be treated as less, no matter their job, their color, or their place. The audience erupted in applause. Ethan and Margaret watched proudly from the front row, tears glistening in their eyes. Over time, the foundation grew beyond anything they imagined. It offered education, legal aid, and housing for mistreated workers. Grace personally visited homes, listened to stories, and helped women who had been too afraid to speak. She became a symbol of dignity, a quiet force that inspired thousands. Newspapers called her the voice of the voiceless. But Grace never let fame change her. Whenever reporters asked about her success, she simply said, "It started with kindness, and it ends with it too." Ethan often joined her on outreach programs, while Margaret became the heart of the initiative, mentoring young caretakers. Together, the three built something beautiful, a legacy born from pain, but grown through compassion. Years later, at an anniversary event, Grace looked out at a sea of smiling faces. Hundreds of people now stood where she once had. People who found their strength again because of her. After her speech, she sat beside Ethan and Margaret, both older but still glowing with pride. Margaret leaned closer and whispered, "Do you remember what I once told you? That angels sometimes walk among us." Grace smiled, nodding. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret's eyes sparkled. "I was talking about you." Grace looked away shyly, her heart full. "I'm no angel, ma'am. I just chose not to stay silent." Ethan added softly, and that choice changed the world. The three sat together, watching as the audience applauded, a sound not of fame, but of gratitude and hope. Moral of the story: money can build walls, but kindness builds bridges. Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet voice that says, "This is wrong." Grace's story reminds us that heroes don't always wear suits or crowns. Sometimes they wear aprons and carry the weight of the world with grace. And in the end, true power doesn't come from fortune. It comes from the strength to stand up for what's right, even when no one else will. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another powerful video. Thanks for watching.